Okay, good morning, everybody. Good to see you, 8:05. We gave everybody an extra 5 minutes because there was a few latecomers and a few people who didn't get the link, etc. So thank you very much for all being there this morning. It's fantastic to see you. We're really happy to welcome a new UniSA colleague, Associate Professor Chris Deneen. He's Enterprise Fellow in the Education Futures Unit here at UniSA, and he's really a specialist in authentic assessment. And as you'll see, there's a bit of a theme developing. We're talking a lot about authentic assessment this year, and Chris is very well placed to speak to us about this topic. So before I hand over to Chris, I'd just like to acknowledge that we meet on the land of the Kaurna today, and these are the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as traditional custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. So I'd like to introduce again Associate Professor Chris Deneen, and I'll hand over to you, Chris.
Well, thank you very much, Stuart. And thank you as well for reaching out to me a few weeks back and saying, hey, would you be interested in doing something like this? And this seems to me a wonderful opportunity to talk with colleagues, both at UniSA and elsewhere, about a topic that I think is tremendously important in higher education, as well as the entire education span. So let me go ahead and move over to sharing the screen. And if I'm very lucky, this will actually work. Here's my PowerPoint, share, and let me go here, pause it. So, do we see a PowerPoint? Is it correct?
We do, but you're in presenter mode, so we can see your next slide as well.
Okay, let me then do one thing here. Turn off my second monitor, because what I find is sometimes if you have two monitors working, it makes the PowerPoint go haywire. Now let's see. How's that?
Yeah, that's perfect, Chris.
Okay, fantastic. Let me just go back here. Sorry, one second. Just a little bit of technical difficulty. My apologies. And what I'm probably going to do then, just to keep this simple, is I'm not going to go into presenter mode. And instead, I'll just go like this. And increase the size on that. How is this? Stuart, can people see this? Do you think this is good enough?
Yes, I can see that.
Okay.
Yeah, that second one is good. Yeah, that looks good, Chris, but we can see all your upcoming slides on the right there.
Okay, I don't see that's a major problem.
No problem.
Yeah. Okay, so as Stuart introduced, this is all about authentic assessment, and I thought I would title this with the pithy phrase, Getting Real, Developing Authenticity in Our Assessment, because really the idea behind authentic assessment is that we develop and deliver a sense of authenticity and realism into our curricula, and in an area that, as I will explain, is probably one of the most important areas to our students, and therefore it should be one of the most important areas to us as well. So I like this as a kind of starting point to look at this and say, well, but where are we right now? And I, a few years ago, stumbled across this cartoon, and it really spoke to me on a very seminal level about the need for authenticity, the idea that when somebody is applying for a position, that they're asked, what skills do you have? Well, I'm very good at test taking. And although most people would not literally say that, I think that it is always playing in the back of our minds, whether we are educators, employers, or people seeking employment, that a lot of our educational experiences are calibrated towards seeing good test taking as an actual outcome. As an assessment person with a pretty strong background in testing, I understand that what testing is actually meant to do is provide indicators and validity-based evidence of more noteworthy and important achievement outcomes, the sophisticated skills and knowledge that we actually want our students to have. But we are in a situation globally where indicators have replaced outcomes. And when indicators replace outcomes, I argue we need different ways of indicating outcomes. Authentic assessment, to me, helps to meet that need. So what does it actually mean? Well, before I begin visiting any definitions on you, I would love to hear a little bit about what you think authentic assessment is. So why don't we take just a minute or two in the chat feature? And I realize this is not enough time to come up with a very sophisticated definition, but that's perfectly okay. I'm very interested to know what your off-the-cuff definition might be. When somebody says authentic assessment or authenticity in academia or in education, what are some of the first things that come to your mind? Just take a moment and I'd love to see what a few of you have to share in the chat feature. Okay, we have our first entry, assessment, which is meaningful. I like that. Now they're rolling in. Let's give it about 20 more seconds or so. So if you want to contribute, please do. Great. You're absolutely welcome to keep adding. Let me just pull a few out right now and share because I think we can all see it. I'll just go quickly. The idea that assessment is meaningful, it has a relationship to the real world. Liz McNeil had a very good specific example that her midwifery students say what to them it means is they see a relevant link between the assessment and their role as a midwife after graduation. And I think that's a very good example of what people are looking for when it comes to authentic assessment. Something you'll do in the real workplace, real world, right? Show real life experience. So sure, what I love about doing these kind of exercises is we very quickly see that there are some points of real confluence in our understanding of what constitutes authenticity in relationship to assessment. So in fact, we're really pretty good at generally describing and spotting its absence too. It's not just that we can define it, it's when we encounter curricula that maybe don't have that whiff of the real. I think generally we're pretty good at spotting it, but actually getting real means we need to be able to apply that into our practice and our students' educational experiences, especially assessment. And I think probably many of you are already doing this. So I'm not operating this session as a deficit model. In other words, I don't start from the assumption that I'm talking to a bunch of folks who don't know how to get real. Rather, I do think many of you probably are already there. So today might be as much about identifying and framing and articulating the authenticity that's already in your work as it is about changing your work. And a little later on, I'll talk through how we can actually get authenticity without necessarily doing massive changes to our assessment plans. But that leads me into the idea of what we're going to be doing today. So I'll talk a little bit about my own background and activity and how that's led me where I am today in terms of authenticity and talking to you. A little bit about the rationales. Why should we concern ourselves with authentic assessment? The idea too about how we can construct and co-construct meaningful understandings of authentic assessment, which is more than just coming to a singular definition. And then I'll quickly offer a very short case study of somebody that I've worked with and done some research with that I think has done some absolutely brilliant work around this area. And then I will hand it over to Stuart, who will lead us in Q&A session, and throughout the session, I'll have some ideas on how to sustain our engagement. So a little bit about me. I started out as a middle school and high school teacher in the US. And when I encountered a lot of problems, what I found is they often revolved around assessment. And certainly the students, when they encountered problems that made them the most anxious, the most concerned, they often revolved around assessment. And what I found too is when I would give assessments, the ones that I was told I should give, the ones I wanted to give, there seemed to be a significant disparity between the ones I kept getting told, well, you should be giving these assessments, and the ones that I thought actually were the most interesting and elicited the most sophisticated answers from the students. So I was consistently told, well, students have to know how to do an essay, which is not wrong. But then it was also, well, for the sake of brevity, you're going to have to give multiple choice questions. And again, while I certainly am not an enemy to either of those means of assessment, I would often find that there was this problem I couldn't quite articulate. But eventually what came to my mind was that I didn't feel like the students were expressing their skills and knowledge in a way that seemed to have a strong relationship with what they valued most in their lives and some of the aspirations that they were sharing with me as well about where they wanted to go in their life. So part of that is what motivated me to do my doctorate in education and go back to school, is to explore questions like this and determine how to effectively not only train students, but train teachers to address those questions. And so that's what led me into teacher education. Over a decade ago, I left the US and I began teaching abroad. And I bring that up specifically because what we consider to be authentic is often highly contextual. And so when I moved from New York to Hong Kong, that was a bit of a context shift. And it was not just about the city, it was also about the students and the culture. And some of the ways in which I could assess in New York had very different responses, and it elicited different responses from the students. And so as I began to learn how to keep it real, what I realized is that that also means be highly cognizant of the context and the learners who have evolved in that context. I also began doing more and more work on research in this area, and that's what led me forward into positions that have increasingly called on me to be at least as much of a researcher and a professional developer as a teacher. And that's brought me to this position where I'm an enterprise research fellow at UniSA. And a lot of the research that I'm doing right now is on how we can engage learners with assessments that are more sophisticated, and in doing so, elicit more sophisticated responses from them. And a big part of that, I would argue, is making sure that those responses correspond to what we consider and they consider to be most important in life. And that includes work as well as their lifelong competencies that get them through their lives. And this also affects my emerging leadership profile. So a lot of the work that I do here is around things like being on the Authentic Assessment Steering Committee and contributing to that. So that's a little bit about my journey into authentic assessment. But let me now talk a little bit about why we might want to consider making that journey in the first place. I think most of us are very familiar with the pressures that universities are facing, not just Australian, worldwide. The idea that there is a call for us to make sure that students are emerging from degree programs with the requisite competencies for life and work. Now, it's quite contested as to what some of these competencies are. It's a bit of a political football, but when you look at things like graduate competency listings, you often see a tremendous amount of simpatico, very much as we saw in the chat feature earlier when people began talking about authentic assessment. And I'm happy that actually there seems to be, regardless of nation, some solid agreement on what some of those competencies look like. So I think it's fair to label these as authentic because they're about competencies for life and for work. And I've given you a few references here that I think are really good references to get you started on thinking about what those look like. And this is a very important point, that it's not just about what we consider to be important. It's also about what will our students pay attention to. And a lot of research has been done on this. I think David Bowd has done some of the best in Australia and worldwide. Students consider what they're assessed on to set the importance, the priorities, but also to set the values. And I'm not going to put it quite as eloquently as David has put it when he's done his keynotes, but effectively what I'm trying to convey is when we assess students, we are engaged in a values proposition. That is, we are telling our students through our assessment what we consider to be most important within our curricula, within their learning, and what they should focus on. So that is why I think it is of the utmost importance that we not just talk about authenticity in the curriculum, that we translate that into authentic assessment so that the priorities that we consider to be lifelong and career long are ones that the students take up, and that we are in effect signposting that to our students as a very effective way of getting them on board with keeping it real. At this point, in a lot of academic talks, would be the slide in which I offer the academically acceptable definition of authentic assessment. I'm not going to do that. And the reason I'm not going to do that, I think, is embodied in this excellent quote from a 2005 piece. Authenticity, it's important. It's tremendously important new mode of assessment, but the problem is it's unspecified. And when we see academics talk about this, it should set up a bit of an alert to us that the problem is probably not that nobody has bothered to define authentic assessment. The problem is probably that it is very slippery. It's hard to actually come to a singular definition of what constitutes authentic assessment. But I would argue that that's not necessarily a bad thing. It suggests that authenticity may be a bit of a moving target. And if we accept that and we instead look for certain fundamental characteristics, then that may actually leave us in a vastly better position to enable authentic assessment, as opposed to attempting to come to a reified definition that is a one-size-fits-all solution for everybody's program and everybody's discipline. So in point of fact, the reason I don't offer a definition here is because I embrace the uncertainty of what constitutes authenticity, and I think it's not a terrible thing for you to also embrace that. However, there are a few characteristics that we can begin to look for. So I'm calling these definitional elements, and I'm also offering a few of the sources that these definitional elements come from. Some of these are pieces that have come from my own research, and you'll see I do cite myself a couple times here. I try to not cite myself too much because I think that's not a terribly good practice for academics. But I also would say that there is a seminal current document on authentic assessment, and I'll share that with you in a few minutes. And this is Villarroel, Bowd, Bloxham, Bruna, and Bruna from 2020. And a lot of this is drawn from them. So I think that they produced a couple really good touchstone documents on authentic assessment. And as I said, I'll share those with you in a bit. So one of the ideas in looking at these definitional elements is correspondence between what we assess in the universities and what graduates do in the outside world. That seemed to be a very central theme to what you had discussed in the chat feature, which is great when we can get that simpatico. So again, it's that point that I think a lot of you are already here. So it's about coming to the backfill of good peer-reviewed evidence that certifies some of our already strong definitions for how we define authenticity. Impacting the quality and depth of learning achieved by the students in the development of higher order cognitive skills. I love this definition because it doesn't necessarily suggest that there's a particular workplace environment that we have to target. Rather, it is the between the ears space of our students and the development of sophistication. And some of that is coming from this research team. I know Kevin Ashford Rowe, and I think he's done some exceptional work in the Australian university context around around authentic assessment. I like too the next one, supporting students' growth and personal confidence. And a couple people mentioned something quite similar to this in the chats. It's not just about the strict cognitive elements. It's also about the affective domain and our students' ability to negotiate the affective domain in the process of the learning and the exposition of their learning. I think that's a tremendously important and very authentic skill. Because when we think about the work that we have to do in a professional context, it's rare for me that there isn't some degree of emotionality or emotional investment in that, even if it's at a low level. So being aware of that and negotiating it seems to me a very important priority in authenticity. And then we go all the way down here, and it talks about representing real life problems, building capacity and trust, developing autonomous, self-regulated practice. These last two are areas that I've worked in quite a bit. And this was a piece back in 2014 that David Bowden and I did together, where we were looking at a university in Hong Kong and getting at the negotiation that went on around assessment. And what we found was that a lot of staff members were extremely excited about revolutionizing their curriculum, and they would do it on paper, they would do it in practice. They began shifting their lectures into flipped modes, but there was one area that a lot of academics were extremely hesitant to change, and that area was assessment. And so we dug into this a little bit, and what we found was that there was a strong mistrust between a lot of the teaching staff and a lot of the senior administrative leadership around accountability. And because assessment is about accountability, not completely, but it plays a role, a lot of the staff were very hesitant to change their assessment because they were worried that it could harm their students, and they were also worried it could harm them. And so when we talk about changing assessment towards authenticity, I really can't emphasize enough that capacity and trust building have to be a universally practiced exercise across the institution so that the staff feel trusted and the administration are trustworthy and the students also share in both of those elements. And then finally, autonomous and self-regulated practice. And I won't get too fine-grained in this except to say that this is something I'm working on right now when it comes to the role of technology. And I'm super excited to be doing this research. And if you want to discuss it a bit in the Q&A, I'm happy to, but I don't want to get too far off course. When I get excited about things, like many of us, I can often just go straight off course, but I'm not going to do that because we only have an hour and I want to hear from you too. And in order to help that, I am actually going to step back for a moment and I'm going to talk a little bit, or rather share with you a little bit about what the University of South Australia is doing around authentic assessment. There are, of course, definitional aspects, and these are some of the definitional aspects that Sheridan and Abelardo have been working on, who they have been playing a major role in helping guide the university towards a very large project around authentic assessment. But rather than attempt to encapsulate that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you a little bit of the video. And we are fortunate too, later on, we'll hear from a little bit from Stuart Dinmore as he manages the Q&A, but I want to give props where it's deserved. Stuart was one of the people who did this video. And I hope you think it's as cool as I think it is. Now, can you see the video?
Yes.
Yes? Thumbs up?
Yes.
Let's see if this works.
The curriculum of our programs and courses is something we are very proud of at UniSA. It's important that our students are receiving information that is up to date and relevant, not only for the jobs of today, but for the jobs of tomorrow. And we pride ourselves on having a curriculum that is strongly research informed. One of the key projects of the Academic Enterprise Plan, which integrates our ambitions in teaching and learning and research, is the Authentic Assessment Project. As part of the Authentic Assessment Project, we hope to take a step back and look at the ways in which we are currently and have traditionally assessed our students. Maybe it's time to rethink the traditional approach of asking students to sit in an examination hall or asking them to submit a 5,000-word essay in preference for more activity-based assessments that will develop the skills they need for the future. By asking the right questions in collaboration with our external partners, our advisory groups, and our students, we can transform our assessment practices to better position our students for the future.
The Authentic Assessment Project is one of the largest teaching and learning projects we've seen at UniSA. Good assessment practices should be at the centre of our program and course design.
Authentic assessments are focused on realistic practices, scenarios, and contexts which develop a student capacity to apply higher-order thinking skills. Such assessment activities lead to richer staff-student engagement, contributing to meaningful feedback and better learning outcomes.
For our students, assessment often acts as a key motivator driving study behaviours. Many of us may have heard someone say, students learn what they think they'll be tested on.
What we may not realize is that frequent low-value assessments like continuous assessment or large high-value assessments like final examinations can fragment learning within a course and fail to make critical connections required for learning at the program level.
Shifting this narrative towards one where assessment activities generate excitement for learning in both staff and students is a motivator behind the Authentic Assessment Project. Over the next few years, we'll be working together to review our current assessment practices, how we report on our assessments, update our policies, procedures, and processes in order to implement authentic assessment throughout our programs. We'll also showcase and celebrate our successes and some of the things that may have not worked, in addition to supporting staff to lead teaching and learning research.
By working together, we can create rich learning environments and provide our students with learning experiences that help them succeed as professionals. We look forward to working with you.
That's a great video. And as Stuart points out, it was really the TIU media team who did the video. So big props on an extremely polished and I think very impactful message. And I'm just showing you the web page here. And perhaps later on during the Q&A, Stuart can give us some of the URLs and put those in the chat. If you want to find out more, regardless of where you are, you're welcome to go to this. It is an externally facing site. Yeah. And one of the things too that I really like, and I've only been here 5 months, so I don't want to talk at great depth around this project because I am not the expert in this project, and I look forward to contributing to it. One thing that I really like is already I can see it's a tremendously collaborative enterprise. And I'm very interested in assessment change management, not just about authenticity, but about any kind of assessment and how we shift into more modernized and innovative ways of approaching assessment. And I cannot stress enough how important it is that be an inductive process. That is consultations with faculty, with students, with the key stakeholders, including those who are external to the university, but need to play a role in understanding our assessments. These are absolutely essential to actually making real and enduring changes to our assessment. It's as true for authentic assessment as it is for any other form. And I'm very happy to be a part of a university that is undertaking that approach. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of some of what's going on at the University of South Australia. But of course, many of you are at other universities. And so maybe in the Q&A or even extending the discussion beyond this one session, there's opportunities to talk a little bit about comparing and contrasting. And of course, I would love to engage with you too as internal or external stakeholders when it's appropriate to do so. So in that same idea, and I think this was conveyed by the video, I think you'll find it on the website, and it's certainly, I hope I'm conveying this idea, is that authenticity should be considered a negotiated thing. What I mean by that is we have different stakeholders who have different agendas. We have our own agenda. So do employers, so do our students. And I invite you to reflect too on who else? Who are other key stakeholders that have a voice or should have a voice in understanding what is real and what should we be targeting in our assessment that we would consider to be authentic and of high value? Because of course, there's millions of things that we know to be real. So we have to come to a certain subset of characteristics or targets that we consider to be of the highest value that we articulate our assessment around. And again, I think you can see that we'll have some disciplinary variation, some cultural context variation. And this is one of the reasons why I say authenticity is negotiated and a bit of a shifting target. And that's a good thing. So these different agendas lead to different priorities and perceptions of authenticity. And I would argue too, that's what makes negotiation tremendously important. And again, it's that idea of an inductive and consultative process in which different people and their voices are heard. That's part of the negotiation, and it's absolutely essential. So in that alignment, I invite you to think about something that's not directly about authentic assessment, but may potentially play a role in something you want to do if you want to undertake authentic assessment or extend the authenticity that you're already engaged in. And that is reimagining the student's role. I cannot tell you how many times over the last 30 years I've been in a classroom, I have been a part of a consultative process. I've talked about things with all the right folks, and somebody will raise their hand and say, so has anyone asked the students? And there'll be a resounding silence within the room, not always, but too often. And we forget sometimes that some of our key stakeholders are the people who are the end users of the assessment, who we are soliciting for exhibitions of excellence. And how can we not then ask them what they consider to be real, what they consider to be authentic? Students certainly aspire to do certain things. We do want to help modify some of those aspirations, but at the same time, we have to be very, very careful to pay attention to what they are already. And our assessments need a whiff of reality, not just to us, but to the people who are going to be engaging with those assessments. And this isn't just an assessment issue. As anyone who has ever tried to get students to do the reading will be able to tell you that it is an incredibly difficult thing. And the research that's been done, for example, around why so many students don't do the reading, it regresses onto this idea that the reading are not necessarily seen as directly authentic. They're a bit abstract. And when students encounter abstractions in the curriculum, they deprioritize those so that they can prioritize what they consider to be the more concrete and valuable elements. And as I said earlier, the research tells us that when we assess students on something, that's us signaling to them, this is what's real, this is what's concrete. So one of the things that you could consider doing is looking a little bit at the Students as Partners movement. And the University of Queensland was kind of the cradle for the Students as Partners network, but it certainly extended internationally well beyond that. And I encourage you to look a little bit at this. And again, we can put this link in the URL in the chat feature as well, so you can give a bit of a look at it. And I won't delve too much into it because, as I say, it's a concomitant area, but it's not one that's directly about authentic assessment. But I encourage you to give it a look. So what does negotiating authentic assessment look like? Well, I would argue that in negotiation, we should strive for a few principles. And these aren't really so much principles of authentic assessment as they are principles for equitable negotiation. So first of all, as I've emphasized already, make sure that our negotiations are inclusive of the key stakeholders. And this may involve both internal and external stakeholders. And when it comes to authenticity, it really has to involve both, doesn't it? Be mindful of power dynamics. Recognize that as we negotiate certain elements of what goes on in the curriculum, we don't want to trigger people's feelings that they are not being allowed to do what they would consider to be appropriate to their professional role. Disempowerment can sometimes occur when we talk about new policies, and especially when those policies impact on what goes on in the classroom. especially if we include our students too. We want to be very cognizant of the fact that we have a power dynamic with our students. So as we partner with them and bring them into these negotiations, try to keep those evident and try to maintain a certain awareness of that. Scoping, setting, and socializing meaningful outcomes. I've underlined socializing because it's the idea that just because this is authentic to us doesn't mean it's authentic to everyone. And that is especially true for our students. I know that in teacher education, there are certain things that students really absolutely need to learn. I might even think, and I do think, that understanding theory and theoretical frameworks are that. I made the mistake early in my career of assuming that students understand that theoretical frameworks are super important for actually acting as a teacher. I got student evaluations back that strongly convinced me that the students did not, in fact, share that view with me. And fortunately, I learned from my student evaluations, and I understood that what I needed to do, I needed to signpost the importance and the authenticity of the things that I considered to be most real. So think about how you could involve signposting in your classroom and in your curriculum so that students are afforded the opportunity to review and consider what you and the discipline consider to be most authentic. I would argue that this leads to a more progressive process than a reified policy. In other words, this isn't necessarily about rolling out a very strict, definitionally driven, university-wide policy, although it certainly helps to have some policies in place at that level. In fact, I think you need them. But they need to, I think, have flexibility to recognize that this is an ongoing and somewhat fluid process, much like the definition of authenticity itself. And finally, I would say it's about empowering yourself as a knowledgeable stakeholder. And so, again, that idea of looking at some of the resources, exploring some possibilities, perhaps even trying an action research project out in your classroom around authentic assessment are fantastic ways for you to gain firsthand real knowledge of what should be authentic in your classroom and how you can best enact that authenticity. So with that in mind, let me give the final part, which is a little bit of a case study. And so this is what I would argue is not just a case study, I would say it's a success story. And it's about better assessment in a large tort law class. And it's not just about authentic assessment, but authentic assessment certainly plays a role. This is when I was working at the University of Hong Kong. There was this absolutely fantastic fellow, Rick Glofcheski, who I was working with very closely on a couple research projects. And he taught Intro to Tort Law, which is a huge class because everyone in the law school has to take it. And he, as you can see, literally wrote the book on tort law in Hong Kong. And so he knew the subject backwards and forwards. But what he was finding a few years back was that the students really were not as engaged with this as he wanted them to be. And while they were giving good essay answers on torts for the final exam, the degree to which those essay responses actually related to the practice of tort law was a pretty tenuous relationship. So he decided to make some changes. The first changes he made were about flipping the classroom. And he did this through producing what he called a digital tort diary. What students would do is that they would go all around Hong Kong and they would look around for potential tort cases, like that scaffolding hasn't been put up properly. There's a huge pothole right there that hasn't been repaired for 3 weeks. I know because I live in the building right in front of it. Here it is. They take a photo of it, and then they construct a portfolio around these tort cases, and they talk through how within an authentic practice-based scenario, they as a lawyer might approach these torts. And I'm not a law professor, as you can clearly see. I can't even pronounce the vocabulary.
We can ask Jennifer McKay.
Thank you. Yes.
Tortious.
Tortious.
Let's start with the two. This is brilliant, Chris.
Thank you.
I need to talk to you.
We will talk, definitely. And so the first part was all about creating these digital diaries. Unfortunately, what Rick encountered was he pushed and said, well, could we do something instead of the final exam? And, people kind of went, no, heavens, no. And he said, all right, fine. I hear the message loud and clear. There has to be a final exam. And that explains the bottom right picture. And it really is invigilated proctors, blue books, desks sitting in rows. So Rick's a great academic, not because he always pushes back at what he's told to do, but sometimes because he manages to negotiate what he has to do to produce different outcomes. And so he said, aha, all right, so how could I make this more realistic while still keeping to what the university says I has to do? Rick invigilates his own exam. And at the beginning of the exam, before anyone turns the exam sheets over, he says, all right, now I'm going to stay here. After the last exam response comes up, we're going to have a discussion. You're not obligated to stay. You don't have to. But in this discussion, we're going to talk about the answers, and we're going to talk about them in the context of actual practice as a lawyer. The first time he did this, Rick told me, he said about 5, maybe 10% of the students actually stayed. But word got around because, you see, the advantage to the students was they got immediate feedback on how they had done on the exam, which, if you know large-scale invigilated exams, sometimes you don't hear anything about them for weeks afterwards, if at all. And whether you can even pick up the blue books, whether anyone chooses to write anything on them as feedback, it's a bit of a crapshoot. This way, Rick was able, within a 45-minute period, to give students a lot of feedback. It was just-in-time feedback. It fit all of the appropriate elements of what we should be doing with feedback, and it helped them contextualize their answers in authentic practice. And some of the key takeaways here from this, it matters. It's impact that matters. And this is some of the research we've done. I researched and published on Rick's digital diary approach. David Carlos out of the University of Hong Kong, who does absolutely brilliant work around assessment and feedback in higher ed. He's done a lot of research based on Rick. By the way, I'm allowed to decloak Rick as a participant by his express permission. Normally, I would not actually use somebody's name, but he says, you're absolutely welcome to do so. And it drives home an important lesson that authenticity is sometimes it's really about reshaping rather than discarding an existing assessment task. And that's a fantastic thing for us because it means that we can get a lot more real sometimes without necessarily a lot of effort. And in fact, one of the critical issues too is think about the amount of time it takes if you were to actually go through all of those Blue Books exams and attempt to provide feedback on each one of them, or even if you had a team of people doing it, versus taking 45 minutes at the end of the exam and having the students emerge actually with a better uptake of the feedback because they don't have to wait 3 or more weeks to get it. So in fact, what Rick was doing was reducing the overhead workload of him and his team while increasing the authenticity of the assessment. And that, to me, is the golden ticket. And certainly the University of Hong Kong has thought so, and everyone else. Here you have this beautiful picture of Rick receiving the University Grants Committee Award for Teaching. Rick has literally won every teaching award you can win in Hong Kong, at the university level, at the region level. And he's taken the money from some of those, and he's actually started up some research conferences on assessment in higher education. And so he's given back to the community as well through his own award winning. And to my mind, that is a tremendous profile of success for the students, but also for the lecturer. And I invite you to consider that what we're talking about today is not just about changing something for the benefit of your students. It's also about understanding that the potential is there for everyone to benefit and for everyone to receive appropriate recognition for making significant, but sometimes not very time-consuming changes in the curriculum. There's potential there for your students to benefit. There's potential for you to benefit. And if it really is about keeping it real, then we can make a very clear argument that the potential is there for society to benefit as well. And so with that in mind, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand off to Stuart, who's going to lead our Q&A. But also beforehand, I just want to say thank you for coming and for getting real. And you're welcome to communicate with me. I put my my email here as well as my Twitter handle. I often post on these kind of things. I'm not a huge tweeter, but I do try and keep it mostly on point with assessment in higher education. And so with that in mind, I look forward to having a bit of a conversation. Let me hand it off to Stuart. And thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Chris. That was fascinating. And it was really great after laying the groundwork that you did throughout the presentation to end with such a really interesting example. I think this is one of the things around authentic assessment that people are really engaged with it, but it's actually manifesting it in their practice that some people stumble over. So that was a really, really interesting example of a way to do that. So if anybody has some questions for Chris, please post them in the chat. We have, and there's a lot of really positive comments, Chris, and some good comments about the importance of actually realising the students as stakeholders in there. So yeah, that's not something we always do so well, but there's a specific question from Scott Copeland. Excuse me. Chris, do you think authentic assessment takes more time? I love the idea of negotiating AA, but in a technical course, it feels like I would first need to teach students what is important. It's a long one. In brackets signposting, before I get around to actually working with students on the technical content. So I guess the question is, do you think authentic assessment takes more time?
It can. Certainly, if we view it as a significant overhaul of the task design, so that students are, for example, doing a problem-based scenario within a real world or real work experience context, that will almost always take more time than, say, an MCQ test. But, and I think this is a critical point, it's not necessarily the idea that we are shifting from a binary, in other words, inauthentic to authentic. It's rather, how can we add authenticity as a variable? And it's a bit of a continuous variable. So I would say that in a case like Scott's, where you do feel time crunch, maybe your objective is not to do a serious overhaul of the assessment tasks, but rather it is to see where there are opportunities that you can shift the assessment slightly towards authenticity, or do a post exercise with the students in which you ground their understanding of the assessment results or the task in the discipline. And, you can even use multiple choice questions and do those around a single problem block, and MCQ test. And you can actually add a degree of authenticity to the MCQ test while still keeping it as an MCQ test.
Okay. Thank you very much. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, there's one here from Helena. When negotiating the assessment design, how can we avoid stakeholder disempowerment by appearing not to take all contributions and views seriously, but still evaluate the highest value targets / characteristics for our assessments?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And it's certainly not one that is just about authentic assessment. It's anytime you're engaged in change management and you solicit multiple stakeholders, it is inevitable that the final product will not reflect everyone. And in fact, one could argue that if it does, we enter into that awful phrase, design by committee. So I think one important thing to do is at the beginning of these negotiations, set that scope. So in other words, say, we are hearing what everyone is saying. Please keep in view that the final individual products may not reflect what everyone has contributed to the group, but that doesn't mean that these contributions did not advance the process. There's no easy solution to that. If there were, good leadership would not be so highly valued and so precious a commodity. But it's tough to do. But I think setting that framework at the beginning where you say we are listening, the contributions matter, the final work product may not always reflect.
Can we keep our microphones muted, please? Unless you want to ask a question, of course. Thanks, Chris. Lorraine's got a comment. The idea of incremental change would be attractive to many staff who are on board but anxious, overstretched. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely, I agree. And
it's the same with so many things. That incremental change is how we do things. Yeah, I agree. Okay, if nobody else has any questions, Jennifer, I don't know if you had a question.
Sheridan has her hand up.
Oh, go ahead, Sheridan.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to thank you for a great presentation. And I've had a few people in Teams chatting back and forth because, as many in the room have been to some of the sessions we've run will know, TOU's been doing some work in this space and really looking forward to, I guess, jumping in and starting to have some deeper conversations around some of the early work we've done around sort of those assessment characteristics, which essentially lends itself to definition and, the authentic assessment scenario, which I think you really picked up on there with that, sort of making things explicit to students so they kind of understand why what you think is important to professional practice. So really exciting project. Love your insights. Love how eloquently you put things today. And I think we're putting a coffee meeting in the diary soon.
Wonderful. I look forward to it, and thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. I would just comment on the law one in particular. It's very rare that you get much discussion of law teaching, and I'll take this back to my colleagues. But I think sometimes the problem is the students don't know what they need to know as a future lawyer, and so they might think you're doing something that's irrelevant. And they come back to you sometimes 4 years later and say, gee, that was useful. Now I'm in practice. But at the time, they might have said, why am I doing this? I want to just go and look at some particular section. So I think I'm teaching environmental law, and taught would have been a compulsory subject, which would have been, that's why the exam process would have been there. The professional bodies require that. But I'd like to have a chat with you later, Chris, too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's worth pointing out, too, that as the higher education sector is diversified and we've embraced students from different backgrounds, many of whom are, adult learners well into their second career, sometimes third, the take it on faith assumption really no longer applies. The idea that, well, I'm just going to assume that I'm being taught this because it matters. I'm not sure it ever really worked, but certainly it doesn't work now. And so I think Jennifer's point is tremendously important that, we do need to make it clear to our students, look, there's a very good set of rationales around why I'm asking you to do these things and why we are looking at these particular pieces of knowledge and skill.
Absolutely. Okay, we have 1 minute left, and there's a quick comment from Helena Robinson. I agree that students may not know what they need to know. We should probably extend our outreach to alumni who have had a chance to reflect on the usefulness of their university learning.
Yes. Let me in a super short time quickly say, I used to run a master's degree program in educational leadership in Singapore, and it was a great program. We were co-branded with Columbia University. A lot of the students, though, were kind of like, why do I have to do all this reading? Why do I have to look at theory? They stopped asking that as soon as we brought in some of the graduates of the program who were occupying some of the top positions in school leadership in Singapore. And everything that we had said, they basically said, but this time the students actually listened because they saw that these were the people that they wanted to become through that degree program. So I could not agree more with that.
Thank you. And on that note, we will wrap things up exactly at 9 o'clock. And I'd just like to extend a huge thanks to you, Chris. We really appreciate your time and effort.
Oh, thank you, Scott.
You've really added a lot of usefulness to getting this invigorating the conversation around AA. And I know that a lot of people here are really appreciative. We will be sending the recording out to everybody who's registered. And I'd just like to thank you all again for making the time and effort to get up this morning and come along. And it won't be long before we are. Sandy, we will be having some croissants at some stage later this year. And I hope to see you all there. So once again, thanks very much. Thank you to Chris, Deneen, and we'll see you next month. Okay, goodbye, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye all. Thank you all for coming.